Cold War. It's the term to describe the battle between the United States and the USSR from 1945 to 1991. It was an ideological battle between the liberal and anti-liberal societies. It's cold because they never actually fought each other. That would be called a hot war. Winston Churchill coined the term Iron Curtain to describe the fact that these two nation-states refused to cooperate or openly communicate with each other, as if a metal wall separated them. Near the end of World War II, the alliance between the Americans and Soviets that was created to defeat the Nazi threat was dissolving. At the Yalta and Potsdam conferences at the end of the war, disagreements broke out over what to do with a defeated Germany. One issue was the creation of spheres of influence. When the Americans helped to liberate Italy, they took control of the government, so that led the Soviet Union to believe that all of the Eastern European countries they had liberated should be under their control. The Soviets wanted to ensure that they had a sphere of influence over Eastern Europe to create a buffer zone between themselves and Western Europe, specifically Germany, who had waged two major wars in less than 40 years. The Soviets had lost up to 30 million people in World War II alone. The Americans feared the idea of the spread of communism, so they rejected that idea of Soviet control of Germany. Instead, the decision was made to split Germany into four pieces, with the capital city of Berlin also divided into four pieces. The Soviets were not impressed with this because Berlin was in their quarter, but we're going to talk about that conflict in the next lesson. So as World War II ends, we have two superpowers who create their own spheres of influence, making the world bipolar. Literally. The Soviets controlled Eastern Europe and established communist dictatorships. Western Europe was in the American sphere of influence, and they encouraged liberal societies, capitalist democracies. The Americans knew they couldn't wage a war to prevent the spread of communism in Europe, so they set up a plan to contain communism. It was known as the Truman Doctrine, and part of that plan included the use of financial rebuilding through the Marshall Plan. By spending millions of dollars to rebuild war-torn countries, those nation-states would become stable. And stable democratic countries don't embrace radical ideas like communism. Of course, the Soviets refused to allow the Eastern European countries to take advantage of the Marshall Plan funds because they didn't want to lose their sphere of influence, so they set up their own called Comcon. Militarily, the Soviets had more soldiers, but the Americans had nuclear bombs. Eventually, the Soviets get their own nuclear arsenal, but we'll talk about that in a lesson on deterrence and brinkmanship. The Americans still worried that Stalin wanted to become the next Hitler to try and take over the world, especially after Stalin tried to get control over Berlin. So they allied with other nations to create NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which was an alliance that stated if any member state was attacked, all member nations would protect them. That way, if Stalin tried to take on moves like Hitler did, invading places like Czechoslovakia, the Soviets would think twice because there would be a serious military force ready to stop them. Later, Stalin created the Warsaw Pact as a counter to NATO's power. So it's the end of the 1940s, and both sides are ramping up the rhetoric, telling the people that the evil empire on the other side of the ocean wants to destroy their superior society, whether it be the Soviet communist utopia or the American capitalist dream. There are several events during the Cold War that could have erupted into all-out war. The Berlin blockade, the Czechoslovakian communist coup, the creation of NATO and the Warsaw Pact, the Korean War, a Hungarian uprising, the building of the Berlin Wall, the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Vietnam War, the Czechoslovakia Prague Spring, the invasion of Afghanistan, even the war between Iran and Iraq. Thank heavens the balance of power between these two nation-states kept these events from becoming World War III. One last thing I want to talk about today is the social implication of the Cold War on American and Canadian society. The baby boomers, that demographic bulge of people added to our population after the war, well, their lives began just as the Cold War began. The actions of the conflicting superpowers influenced their outlook on the world, and they questioned whether the actions of the government really were in the best interests of the people. Like the philosophers during the Enlightenment centuries earlier, these young people questioned why society was organized the way it was and fought back. They were referred to as the Counterculture. That's the hippie movement with their anti-war protests, the peaceniks, the civil rights movement, and the increasing number of feminists who demanded equal rights for women. This questioning of authority concerned many of the adults who were conservative in their views of society. They felt that during this time of heightened fear and security, we should trust our authority figures. The fear wasn't all hype. Soviet spies were found in both Canada and the United States. The Rosenbergs were a couple discovered in the US who were stealing nuclear technology secrets to help the Soviets with their nuclear program. But some government officials took advantage of the fear, the Red Scare. Most famous are the congressional hearings led by Senator Joseph McCarthy, who had people interrogated and blacklisted as supporters of communism. It became a witch hunt as people were labeled as communists by their political enemies as a way to get revenge. People who fought for women's rights or improved child labor laws were labeled as communist sympathizers. Many actors in Hollywood were suspected and charged. Once you were blacklisted, it was difficult to ever get a good job again, and you were discriminated against by members of your community. Most of the convictions were later overturned as it was found that the court procedures hadn't been followed and people's rights had been violated. That was a very illiberal event in U.S. history. This era also led to an unprecedented military buildup. When Eisenhower became president, he warned the nation of what he labeled the military-industrial complex. In other words, there was such an emphasis on military buildup when the nation wasn't even at war that it created a massive industry that employed thousands of people. He worried that lobbyists from these industries would convince the government to hype up any suspected threat in order to garner public support for increased spending on military supplies. This warning went somewhat unheeded, and even today there are concerns with the level of influence private military manufacturing businesses have over government. In our next video, we're going to look at the time and money that was spent to prevent the spread of communism, also known as containment.